In 1930s Korea, a 16-year-old girl named Yang Soo Lee was promised factory work to help her impoverished family. Instead, she found herself on a train to Taiwan, surrounded by dozens of other young women. None of them knew they were being transported into a system of military sexual slavery designed by the Japanese army. This is how a calculated policy of fear and control transformed ordinary lives into nightmares. In the 1930s Korean countryside, families rose each morning to a reality defined by scarcity and submission. Rice paddies once owned by their ancestors now yielded harvests for distant colonial administrators. Japanese officials collected heavy taxes that left farming households with barely enough to survive the winter months. Young men were routinely conscripted for labor projects, building roads and military installations far from home. Leaving village is populated mostly by women, children, and the elderly. This systematic draining of resources created a landscape where simple sustenance became a daily struggle. Young women faced particularly limited prospects under this occupation. With few educational opportunities beyond primary school and traditional social restrictions still in place, their options narrowed to farm labor, domestic service, or factory work. Japanese recruiters began appearing in these rural communities, offering contracts for textile mills and canning factories in Manchuria or Japan itself. For families facing another lean season, these offers represented potential salvation. A daughter's wage might prevent the loss of their land or home. Many parents reluctantly agreed, viewing the separation as a necessary sacrifice for the family's survival. Daily life carried the constant presence of imperial authority. Korean police under Japanese command enforced curfews and travel restrictions, while military patrols monitored movement between villages. Identity documents became essential for any journey beyond one's immediate vicinity. Markets operated under watchful eyes, with suspicions of black market activity bringing harsh punishments. The ordinary rhythms of rural life continued: planting, harvesting, seasonal festivals, but now unfolded under the shadow of foreign control and the anxiety it bred. After Japan's full invasion of China in 1937, conditions deteriorated further in occupied territories. Chinese villages along transportation routes faced requisition of food stores and frequent searches multiplied along roads and rivers, where soldiers exercised arbitrary authority over civilian movement. Women traveling to market faced intrusive inspections and the constant threat of harassment. Displacement became common as fighting destroyed homes and farms, creating streams of refugees searching for safety that rarely existed. This environment of economic pressure and military domination created perfect conditions for exploitation. The same recruiters who promised factory jobs began appearing more frequently, now with tales of well-paid work in newly occupied territories. Desperate families, having seen their traditional livelihoods diminished or destroyed, increasingly viewed these offers as their best available option. They could not know that these promises formed the initial recruitment mechanism for a system of sexual slavery that would exploit their vulnerability. The stage was set for tragedy, with economic desperation masking the approaching horror. During the early stages of Japan's military expansion, senior officers documented troubling patterns emerging among occupation forces. Field reports from China described soldiers frequently leaving their posts to seek out local women, resulting in disciplinary incidents that undermined unit cohesion. These unauthorized excursions not only created security vulnerabilities, but also generated friction with civilian populations, complicating the military's efforts to maintain control over occupied territories. The medical consequence is proved equally concerning for command staff. Venereal disease rates among frontline units reached alarming levels, with some regiments reporting infection rates that threatened operational readiness. Sick soldiers required treatment and recovery time, diminishing combat effectiveness at critical moments. Medical officers warned that uncontrolled transmission could potentially disable entire units, recalling historical precedents where diseases had devastated military campaigns. Officers like Okabe Neasaber of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force recorded these concerns in private diaries, revealing the military's preoccupation with discipline and efficiency. His writings show officers viewing sexual violence not as a moral failing, but as a logistical problem requiring systematic management. The military hierarchy feared that random assaults would alienate local populations, fuel resistance movements, and ultimately compromise Japan's imperial. This cold calculus led to the development of an institutional solution. Rather than addressing the root cause of soldier behavior, planners sought to contain its consequence through regulated facilities. The concept emerged of establishing controlled environments where sexual activity could be monitored and managed like any other military supply operation. These facilities would theoretically prevent disease transmission through medical oversight, while reducing incidents of unauthorized violence against civilians. The approach reflected military thinking that prioritized operational effectiveness above all other considerations. Women became categorized as necessary provisions for maintaining troop morale and discipline, their humanity secondary to logistical requirements. Commanders reasoned that providing organized access to women would prevent the disorder of individual soldiers seeking their own arrangements across the countryside. This institutional mindset produced the blueprint for what would become known as comfort stations. The system was conceived not from compassion, but from cold military, calculated response to the dual threats of disease and disciplinary breakdown. Planners developed detailed regulations covering everything from medical inspections to pricing structures, creating a framework that would normalize sexual exploitation as part of military operations. The transition from theoretical solution to implemented system occurred rapidly once the decision was made. Military administrators began coordinating with civilian authorities and private contractors to establish the first facilities near major troop concentrations. The machinery of recruitment and transportation was set in motion, transforming abstract planning into concrete reality for thousands of women across Asia. What began as entries in officers' diaries would soon become a network of suffering spanning multiple countries. Military planners transformed their theoretical solution into detailed operational guidelines. Documents circulated through various Army departments specified precise regulations governing the new comfort stations. These papers covered everything from facility construction standards to financial accounting procedures, creating a comprehensive framework for systematic exploitation. The bureaucratic nature of these directives revealed how thoroughly the military had institutionalized were established with meticulous attention to detail. Japanese women commanded the highest rates at approximately 2 yen per visit, Korean women 1.5 yen, and Chinese women 1 yen. This ethnic hierarchy reflected prevailing colonial attitudes and demonstrated how racial prejudice became embedded in the system's economic model. Soldiers received specific time allocations for their visits, with officers granted longer periods than enlisted men. Medical protocols appeared frequently in the regulations. Mandatory examinations were scheduled twice weekly, typically on Mondays and Fridays. Station managers were instructed to maintain detailed health records for each woman and to isolate those showing signs of infection. In practice, medical care focused primarily on protecting soldiers rather than treating the women, with scarce resource is often diverted to maintain military readiness. The system operated on a self-funding model that required no budget allocation from military authorities. Soldiers paid for access using their own wages, making the stations financially self-sustaining. Managers kept precise ledgers tracking income and expenses, submitting regular reports to military supervisors. This financial documentation created an illusion of legitimate enterprise within the brutal reality of sexual slavery. Operational locations were selected for maximum military convenience. Stations were established within walking distance of troop concentrations, often in converted houses or specially constructed buildings near barracks. Transportation schedules were coordinated with unit rotations, ensuring a constant flow of soldiers without disrupting combat operations. The system functioned with the efficiency of any other military supply service. The extensive paperwork generated by this system demonstrates its calculated, institutional nature. This was not random violence or improvised exploitation, but a carefully planned operation approved at high levels. Regulations specified everything from cleaning schedules to profit distributions, creating a facade of normalcy behind which unimaginable suffering occurred. These documents would later provide crucial evidence of systematic planning. They showed military officials discussing facility management with the same clinical detachment they applied to ammunition supplies or rations. The bureaucratic language concealed human tragedy behind terms like comfort from women policy to practice required massive human procurement. With regulations established and facilities prepared, the military machinery turned to obtaining women in sufficient numbers. Recruitment mechanisms expanded rapidly, utilizing both deceptive promises and direct coercion to meet the growing demand across occupied territories. Recruiters began traveling through rural villages across Korea and occupied territories, specifically targeting families with teenage daughters. These agents, often working with local police or officials, presented convincing offers of employment that seemed like rare opportunities. They described well-paying factory positions in Japan, restaurant work in newly developed industrial areas, and domestic service positions for wealthy families. To desperate parents struggling with poverty and heavy taxes, these offers represented potential economic salvation for their entire family. The recruitment process followed established patterns. Brokers received substantial payments for each young woman they delivered to collection points, creating financial incentive to maximize numbers. They used official-looking paperwork and contracts to lend legitimacy to their offers, sometimes even providing small advance payments to families. Parents, seeing these apparently legitimate documents and trusting the involvement of local authorities, often consented despite their reservations about sending daughters far from home. The young women themselves genuinely believed they were embarking on legitimate employment opportunities. Many saw these positions as their only chance to help their families financially or to experience life beyond their impoverished villages. They packed their few belongings with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, saying tearful goodbyes to parents and siblings who believed the separation would be temporary and beneficial for all. Transportation was arranged through official channels that further reinforced the illusion of legitimate employment. Groups of women traveled together on trains with proper tickets, boarded ships with documentation, and rode in military trucks that suggested government approval of their journey. The use of established transport routes and vehicles made the process appear orderly and authorized, preventing early suspicion among the recruits. Subtle signs began to indicate that something was wrong. Windows on trains and trucks were sometimes covered or barred, preventing passengers from seeing their changing surroundings. Destinations were altered without explanation, with promised factory towns replaced by remote military zones. Guards armed with rifles accompanied the transports, their presence suggesting these were not ordinary employment transfers. The women were grouped in increasingly large numbers, making individual resistance or escape attempts difficult. Dozens, then hundreds of young women found themselves moving through transportation hubs under close supervision. They shared growing concerns, but lacked means to communicate with the outside world or understand their true destination. The ordinary sounds of train stations and ship harbors masked the extraordinary nature of their situation. Some recruits attempted to question their handlers about the discrepancies between promised jobs and their current circumstances. They received vague reassurances or outright threats, with guards making it clear that compliance was their only option. The language barrier between Korean women and Japanese officials often prevented clear communication, leaving the women isolated with their growing fears. The final stage of transportation typically involved movement to remote locations far from population centers. Trucks traveled down unpaved roads to compounds surrounded by fences or natural barriers. The absence of factories or residential areas at these destinations confirmed the women's worst suspicions. They arrived at military installations where their value would be measured in soldiers served rather than products manufactured. This systematic deception spanned thousands of miles and involved numerous government and military officials. The coordination required suggested high-level planning rather than isolated criminal activity. Paperwork moved through channels, transportation schedules were maintained, and payments were processed, all creating the appearance of normal employment operations while concealing human trafficking. On an industrial scale, while deception accounted for many recruits, the system increasingly relied on direct force as the war expanded. Police and military units conducted systematic raids on villages across occupied territories, targeting homes where young women were known to reside. These operations, breaking down doors and seizing terrified women from their families, the element of surprise and show of force left little opportunity for resistance or escape. Women were taken from various locations beyond their homes. Marketplaces became hunting grounds where soldiers identified potential targets among shoppers and vendors. Factories and farms lost female workers during daylight hours, taken from workplaces under the pretense of questioning that never ended. Even streets became dangerous spaces where any woman traveling alone risked abduction by passing military patrols. Resistance brought immediate violence. Soldiers used physical force to overcome struggling women, with beatings and threats becoming standard procedure. Many abductees reported being told their families would suffer consequences if they resisted, creating psychological leverage that ensured compliance. This calculated use of fear extended the military's control beyond physical confinement to emotional manipulation. The Dutch East Indies demonstrated how colonial authorities facilitated the process. Local police under Japanese command provided lists of potential candidates and helped identify vulnerable women. This collaboration expanded the recruitment network beyond military channels, making the system more efficient and widespread. The involvement of multiple authorities created an atmosphere where no institution could be trusted for protection. European women in occupied territories also became targets, breaking racial barriers that had previously offered some protection. Dutch, Australian, and other Western women found themselves subjected to the same system that had primarily targeted Asian women. This expansion demonstrated that the military's priority was meeting demand rather than maintaining racial hierarchies when necessary. The system's geographic reach grew with Japanese military advances. Women were taken from the Philippines to Indonesia, from China to various Pacific islands. Nationality provided no protection. Korean, Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, Dutch, and other women all became victims. This multinational scope revealed the system's fundamental nature as a military supply operation rather than a culturally specific practice. Social status offered equally inadequate protection. Educated women, married women, and even those from wealthy families were taken when identified as suitable candidates. The military's need for large numbers of personal circumstance or background, this indiscriminate approach showed the system's ruthless efficiency in meeting its objectives. The methods evolved as the war progressed. Later in the conflict, military authorities increasingly delegated abduction tasks to police forces, demonstrating how the system became institutionalized across different branches of authority. This shift reflected both the growing demand for women and the normalization of forced recruitment practices. Survivor accounts describe the sudden violence of abduction and the terror of forced confinement. Women spoke of being forbidden from communicating with each other while being transported to unknown destinations. The complete loss of control over their lives and futures created psychological trauma that would endure for decades. Their testimonies reveal how calculated cruelty became standard procedure within the system. This organized abduction network demonstrated the military's absolute control over occupied populations. No woman could consider herself safe regardless of age, status, or location. The systematic nature of these operations, involving coordination between military and civil authorities, showed this was official policy rather than random acts of violence. The machinery of exploitation now turned to organizing the stations where these women would be held. Women in the comfort stations awakened each morning to the same brutal routine. Soldiers began queuing outside their rooms before dawn, sometimes forming lines that stretched through corridors and out into courtyards. Each woman was expected to serve dozens of men daily, with documented accounts ranging from 30 to over 60 soldiers per day. The relentless pace allowed no breaks between visitors, creating an assembly-line procession of sexual violence that continued until late evening. Refusal brought immediate and severe punishment. Women who resisted certain acts or showed defiance faced systematic beatings with wooden rods or leather straps. Some were denied food for days, their already meager rations withheld as disciplinary measures. More extreme punishments included solitary confinement in cramped storage spaces or exposure to harsh weather conditions. These calculated punishments served to break resistance through a combination of physical pain and psychological terror. The women were stripped of their identities upon arrival or Japanese names, replacing their given names and severing connections to their previous lives. This dehumanizing practice made them interchangeable components within the system, easier to manage and replace as needed. Personal belongings were confiscated, photographs destroyed, and any attempts to maintain connections with home were forcefully suppressed. Comfort stations operated with military precision that mirrored other supply operations. Unit commanders scheduled specific time blocks for their soldiers, organizing visits by rank and unit designation. Station managers maintained detailed logs tracking the number of visitors per woman, income generated, and any disciplinary incidents. This bureaucratic record keeping created a facade of normalcy that concealed the horrific reality occurring within those rooms. Movement between locations followed military needs rather than human considerations. As troops advanced or retreated, women were transported to new stations along supply routes. These transfers occurred without warning, packing groups into trucks or trains for journeys to unfamiliar territories. The constant displacement prevented the formation of stable relationships or escape plans, maintaining the women's isolation and dependence on their captors. The physical environment reflected the system's oppressive nature. Converted house is featured small rooms with minimal furnishings, often just a thin mat on the floor and a wash basin. Windows were boarded or barred to prevent escape attempts, while doors locked from the outside ensured constant confinement. Specially built facilities followed similar designs, with narrow corridors connecting identical cells designed for maximum operational efficiency rather than human comfort. Guard patrols maintained constant surveillance around station perimeters. Armed soldiers monitored all entrances and exits, challenging any unauthorized movement. The station's proximity to military base provided both convenience for soldiers and security for the system, ensuring quick response to any disturbances. This security apparatus created a prison-like atmosphere where escape attempts carried extreme risks. Conditions varied somewhat between rear area stations and frontline facilities, though all shared the same fundamental brutality. Established stations near major base might offer slightly better physical conditions, with more permanent often structures operated from tents or makeshift shelters with minimal facilities. Remote locations faced supply shortages that increased suffering, with limited food, water, and medical supplies. The environment was systematically designed to break human will through isolation repetition, and control. Women lost all autonomy over their bodies, time, and basic needs. Their existence became reduced to serving soldiers, surviving punishment, and enduring the endless cycle of abuse. This calculated destruction of personhood ensured compliance through complete physical and psychological domination. The architectural and operational design served one overriding purpose: efficient exploitation. Every element, from the locked doors to the scheduling systems, was optimized for maximum output with minimal resistance. The women became prisoners in a machine designed to extract sexual service while preventing any form of individual agency or escape. This systematic approach to human degradation represented one of the most calculated forms of institutionalized violence in modern warfare. Dawn in the comfort stations brought not daylight, but another cycle of suffering. Women rose from thin mats to clean their small rooms and prepare for the day's relentless procession. They scrubbed floors, disposed of condoms from the previous night, and washed their bodies in whatever water was available. This brief period of relative quiet ended when soldiers began forming queues outside their doors, sometimes before official opening hours. The sound of boots gathering in corridors signaled the beginning of another day of endless violation. Each woman faced a continuous stream of soldiers that could number 50 or 60 men daily. Military schedules organized visits into timed blocks, with officers receiving priority access and longer sessions. Enlisted men followed in rapid succession, each allowed approximately 1 hour according to regulations that were rarely enforced in practice. The actual encounters often lasted mere minutes, creating a brutal rhythm of entry and exit that continued for 12 hours or more. Women had no breaks between visitors, no moments of privacy, no opportunity to recover physically or emotionally. The physical damage accumulated quickly under this constant assault. Bruises covered their bodies from rough handling, while internal injuries went untreated and unrecognized, despite occasional medical examinations, with women forced to continue working even when visibly ill. Chronic pain became a constant companion, ignored by station managers focused on maintaining the flow of soldiers. The relentless nature of the work caused musculoskeletal damage that would trouble survivors for decades. Psychological trauma deepened with each passing day of captivity. Women described losing sense of time, their lives reduced to counting soldiers rather than days or weeks. Some developed dissociative states to endure the continuous violations, mentally separating from what was happening to their bodies. The constant humiliation and degradation eroded their sense of self until many believed they deserved their fate. This psychological breaking was precisely what the system intended: to create compliant instruments rather than thinking human beings. Resistance brought immediate and severe consequences. Women who refused certain acts or showed defiance faced systematic beatings with wooden rods or leather straps. Some were deprived of food for days, their already meager rations withheld as punishment. More extreme measures included solitary confinement in storage closets or exposure to harsh weather conditions. These calculated punishments served to eliminate resistance through a combination of physical pain and psychological terror. The threat of violence maintained constant control over the women. Station managers and guards employed random punishments to prevent organized resistance or escape attempts. Women never knew when a minor infraction might bring severe retaliation, creating an atmosphere of perpetual fear. This environment of controlled terror ensured compliance even when supervision was minimal, as women internalized the certainty that any resistance would be met with disproportionate force. The endless cycle continued day after day, week after week, with no relief or respite. Women served soldiers through illness and injury, through menstrual periods and pregnancies, through despair and psychological collapse. The system was designed to extract maximum service while providing minimum care, treating human beings as disposable resources. This calculated exploitation created physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal, even for those who eventually gained their freedom. The daily horror became a permanent condition, its rhythm imprinted on bodies and minds. As Japanese forces advanced across Asia, the comfort station system followed like a grim shadow. Within weeks of military occupation in new territories, the same pattern emerged. Recruiters appeared, facilities were established, and local women were brought into the system. From northern China to the Philippine Islands, from the Dutch East Indies to Burmese jungles, the machinery of sexual slavery replicated itself with chilling efficiency. The occupation of each new territory triggered the immediate implementation of this organized exploitation. The methods remained consistent across regions. In the Philippines, recruiters promised jobs in restaurants or laundry services for military installations. In Indonesia, local authorities under Japanese control helped identify vulnerable women from both European and indigenous populations. Chinese women near military bases faced direct abduction during village raids. The system adapted slightly to local conditions but maintained its core function, providing sexual services to soldiers while minimizing resistance and disease transmission. Transport networks expanded to accommodate the growing system. Military ships that carried troops and supplies also transported women between territories. Trains moving through occupied regions included cars designated for human cargo. Documentation was arranged through military channels, with papers describing the women as laborers or service workers. This logistical coordination demonstrated the institutional nature of the operation, requiring cooperation between various army departments and civilian authorities. The scale of the network became enormous as the war progressed. Hundreds of documented comfort stations operated across Asia, with many more temporary facilities in frontline areas. The system served millions of soldiers across thousands of miles of occupied territory. This geographic spread showed how essential military planners considered these facilities to their operational efficiency. The Comfort Women's System became one of the largest organized programs of sexual slavery in modern warfare. Different ethnic groups faced similar treatment within the stations, though racial hierarchies influenced their experiences. Japanese women typically received slightly better conditions and higher status, while Korean women faced particular prejudice as colonial subjects. European women captured in Dutch colonies finding themselves subjected to the same system as Asian women. Despite these variations, all shared the same fundamental reality of forced sexual servitude. The system's expansion demonstrated Japan's ability to project organized violence across its growing empire. Military planners treated comfort stations as necessary infrastructure, similar to supply depots or field hospitals. Their establishment followed standard procedures that could be implemented rapidly in new territories. This systematic approach showed how sexual exploitation had been institutionalized within military operations rather than occurring as random acts of violence. Survivor accounts from different regions reveal striking similarities in their experiences. Women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia describe identical patterns of deception, transportation, and daily routine. They speak of the same brutal conditions, the same medical neglect, the same psychological breaking. These consistent testimonies across cultures and geographies confirm the systematic nature of the program. The transnational scope of the Comfort Women's System created a shared legacy of trauma across Asia. Women from multiple countries endured the same calculated exploitation under Japanese military authority. Their suffering connected diverse cultures through a common experience of institutionalized sexual violence. This systematic replication of horror across occupied territories demonstrated the military's cold efficiency in transforming human beings into instruments of war. The machinery of exploitation had become a permanent feature of Japan's imperial project. Japanese soldiers encountered the comfort stations with varied reactions that revealed the system's psychological complexities. Officers presented these facilities as necessary provisions for maintaining military discipline and preventing rape incidents among troops. They framed the stations as practical solutions to the problems of venereal disease and unauthorized violence against civilians. This official narrative provided a veneer of legitimacy that many soldiers accepted without question, viewing the women as sanctioned amenities similar to ration distribution or field hospitals. Some soldiers recorded their discomfort in personal diaries, though such expressions remained rare. These private writings occasionally mentioned feelings of guilt or unease, described the women's eyes as empty windows that haunted him afterward. Another questioned how civilized men could participate in such systematic exploitation. These individual moments of moral hesitation were typically suppressed in the military environment that discouraged any criticism of official policies. The payment system reinforced the illusion of legitimacy for many participants. Soldiers used their own wage to access the stations, creating a transactional framework that masked the coercion involved. The exchange of money made the encounters feel like commercial transactions rather than acts of systematic rape. This financial aspect helped soldiers distance themselves emotionally from the reality of the women's situation, treating them as paid services rather than enslaved human beings. Racial hierarchies within the stations influenced soldier behavior and perception. Japanese women commanded higher prices and often received slightly better treatment, reinforcing colonial attitudes about ethnic superiority. Korean and Chinese women faced more brutal treatment from soldiers who viewed them as inferior colonial subjects. These differential treatment patterns mirrored the broader racial prejudices within Japanese society and the military structure. Some soldiers developed complicated relationships with specific women they visited regularly. These attachments occasionally led to small acts of kindness, extra food, stolen moments of conversation, or protection from other soldiers. However, these gestures existed within the fundamental power imbalance of the system. Even sympathetic soldiers ultimately participated in the women's exploitation. Their minor kindness is unable to alter the brutal reality. Military culture strongly discouraged questioning the comfort station system. Soldiers who expressed doubts risked being seen as weak or disloyal to their units. The hierarchical nature of military service compelled obedience to established practices. Many soldiers simply accepted the stations as another aspect of army life, no more remarkable than other military routines they followed without understanding their full implications. The patterns established in the comfort stations influenced behavior beyond the war itself. Soldiers who became accustomed to treating women as commodities sometimes continued these attitudes after returning home. The normalization of sexual exploitation, psychological effects that affected their post-war relationships and attitudes. This demonstrates how institutionalized systems of abuse can reshape individual moral frameworks. The soldiers' varied response revealed the system's psychological impact on both perpetrators and victims. Some men compartmentalized their participation, others felt lingering guilt, while many simply accepted it as military necessity. Their justifications and reactions show how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty when supported by institutional frameworks. The comfort station system didn't just victimize women, it also corrupted the moral landscape of those who participated in it, creating psychological wounds that would outlast the war itself. Japan's surrender in August 1945 brought chaos rather than liberation for many comfort women. As military units retreated or disbanded, thousands of women were abandoned at remote stations across Asia. Some found themselves left behind in jungle outposts or island garrisons without food or transportation. Others were simply released near military bases with no resources or guidance. These women faced the daunting task of finding their way home across war-devastated landscapes without money, documents, or safe passage. The journey home became another ordeal for survivors. Many walked for weeks along destroyed roads, begging for food and shelter. They encountered other displaced persons, ruined cities, and continued violence in post-war unrest. Some hitched rides on military trucks or crowded trains, facing further danger during travel. The physical injuries and illnesses from their captivity made these journeys even more difficult, with many women suffering from untreated conditions that worsened during their travels. Returning survivors faced profound social stigma in their communities. Traditional societies viewed sexual purity as essential for marriage, branding these women as damaged or dishonored. Families often urged silence about their experiences, sometimes pretending daughters had been away doing factory work. Many survivors never married or had children, either by choice or because potential partners rejected them. This social isolation added psychological trauma to their physical suffering, creating lives of quiet desperation. Medical needs went largely unaddressed in the post-war period. Few women sought treatment for gynecological injuries or sexually transmitted diseases. Chronic pain and infertility became lifelong burdens carried in silence. Psychological trauma manifested as nightmares, anxiety, and depression that went unrecognized and untreated. The women suffered in isolation, their wounds invisible to societies focused on rebuilding from war. Japanese authorities systematically destroyed documents related to the comfort women system as defeat approached. Military records, transport manifests, and facility paperwork were burned or discarded to conceal the program's scale and organization. This destruction of evidence was deliberate and widespread, creating a historical void that would later complicate efforts to establish the truth. The few documents that survived did so through chance or concealment by individuals. Allied forces encountered comfort stations during their advance across Asia, but took limited action. Military intelligence documented the facilities and interviewed some women, but these findings received little attention at higher levels. The Tokyo War crimes trials focused on other atrocities, with sexual slavery receiving minimal consideration. Political considerations during the emerging Cold War made thorough investigation of Japanese war crimes less pressing to Western powers. The immediate post-war period buried the comfort women's story beneath broader narratives of conflict and reconstruction. Societies focused on honoring military casualties and rebuilding infrastructures, not on addressing uncomfortable truths about sexual violence. The women's experience didn't fit prevailing narratives about war and heroism, making their stories easier to ignore. This collective silence would last for decades, during which survivors carried their trauma alone. The end of fighting thus began a different kind of captivity for most survivors, a prison of silence and shame that would confine them for nearly 50 years. Their liberation from the stations marked only the beginning of a lifelong struggle with physical, psychological, and social consequences. The war's conclusion brought peace to nations, but not to the women whose bodies had been battlefields. Their wounds remained open and unacknowledged, waiting for a future generation to finally listen. The Tokyo War crimes trials of 1946-1948 established important legal precedents for addressing wartime atrocities, but largely ignored the systematic sexual slavery implemented primarily on conventional war crimes and crimes against peace, with sexual violence receiving minimal attention despite overwhelming evidence. Prosecutors chose not to prioritize cases involving comfort women, considering them secondary to establishing responsibility for aggression and mass casualties. This selective focus created a significant gap in historical accountability that would persist for decades. Cold War political considerations further diminished the likelihood of addressing the comfort women issue. As Japan transformed from wartime enemy to strategic ally against communism, American officials showed little interest in revisiting uncomfortable aspects of Japan's wartime conduct. The United States prioritized maintaining good relations with its new Pacific partner over pursuing justice for victims of sexual slavery. This geopolitical calculation ensured that the comfort women system remained outside mainstream historical narratives and diplomatic discussions. Japan's post-war government developed a systematic approach to avoiding responsibility for the comfort women system. Official narratives emphasized military achievements and national suffering while minimizing discussion of wartime atrocities. Historical textbooks used in schools either omitted reference is to comfort stations or described them as voluntary prostitution services. Government officials consistently argued that private entrepreneurs rather than military authorities operated the facilities, despite considerable evidence to the contrary. Survivors who attempted to speak out faced coordinated denial and public skepticism. Government spokesmen dismissed their accounts as unverified or exaggerated, while conservative media outlets portrayed them as fabrications designed to extort compensation. The women's claims were met with bureaucratic obstacles and legal technicalities that prevented serious consideration. This institutional resistance created an atmosphere where truth-telling became an act of courage rather than a pathway to justice. Compensation claims followed a predictable pattern of rejection and delay. Government agencies employed various strategies to avoid financial responsibility, including questioning the validity of documentation and challenging the interpretation of historical evidence. When private organizations attempted to establish compensation funds, opposition limited their effective payments and did so through non-governmental channels rather than official acknowledgement of state responsibility. This avoidance strategy continued essentially unchanged for nearly 5 decades. Multiple administrations maintained consistent positions denying direct military involvement and state responsibility. The issue received little attention in diplomatic exchanges or public discourse until the 1990s. This prolonged silence allowed generations to grow up with incomplete understanding of Japan's wartime conduct and its impact on women across Asia. The consequences of this avoidance extended beyond national borders, creating lasting diplomatic tensions with neighboring countries. South Korea, China, the Philippines, and other affected nations viewed Japan's position as reflecting insufficient remorse for wartime actions. The comfort women issue became a recurring source of friction in regional relations, affecting everything from trade agreements to security cooperation. Historical memory continued to shape contemporary politics in ways that hindered reconciliation and mutual understanding. The systematic denial of responsibility also affected how other nations addressed wartime sexual violence in subsequent conflicts. The lack of precedent from the Tokyo trials meant that sexual slavery remained largely outside international legal frameworks until much later. This gap in accountability contributed to the perpetuation of similar practices in other conflicts, as the historical example suggested such crimes might not face serious consequences. The failure to address the comfort women system comprehensively had implications that extended far beyond Japan's bilateral relationships. Surviving diaries and letters from Japanese soldiers revealed complex perspectives on the comfort station system. Some entries expressed discomfort with the institutionalized nature of the facilities, describing unease about participating in what they recognized as systematic exploitation. A soldier stationed in China wrote of his discomfort seeing the same woman repeatedly, noting how her eyes seemed increasingly vacant with each visit. These private reflections suggest moral qualms that soldiers rarely expressed publicly within their units. Other soldiers viewed the stations as necessary military provisions, similar to food rations or medical care. They accepted the official rape and disease outbreaks. Many considered the women as provided amenities rather than victims, seeing their participation as a legitimate benefit of military service. This perspective was reinforced by the payment system that made encounters feel transactional rather than coercive. Officers frequently mandated visits to the stations as disciplinary measures. Unit commanders ordered soldiers to use the facilities to reduce incidents of unauthorized violence against local civilians. Some officers even scheduled regular unit visits, treating them as necessary maintenance for troop morale and health. This top-down pressure normalized participation and discouraged questioning of the system's morality. The military framework presented the stations as health and hygiene measures. Soldiers received condoms with instructions on proper use to prevent disease transmission. Medical officers explained the importance of regulated facilities for maintaining unit readiness. This clinical framing allowed soldiers to view their actions through the lens of military necessity rather than moral choice. Daily routine further normalized the system. Soldiers grew accustomed to seeing comfort stations near their bases, their operation as regular as meal distributions or equipment inspections. The bureaucratic aspects payment procedures, scheduled visits, medical checks created an illusion of legitimacy. What began as unsettling became ordinary through repetition and institutional acceptance. Few soldiers questioned the fundamental morality of institutionalized rape. The military environment discouraged critical thinking about official policies. Hierarchical obedience and unit cohesion pressures overrode individual moral reservations. Those who felt uncomfortable typically remained silent rather than challenging the system. The patterns established in the comfort stations influenced soldier behavior beyond their military service. Men who became accustomed to treating women as commodities sometimes carried these attitudes home after the war. The normalization of sexual exploitation during service created psychological effects that affected post-war relationships and social attitudes. This collective adaptation to atrocity demonstrates how systems can corrupt ordinary people. Soldiers who might never have committed individual acts of sexual violence participated willingly in systematic exploitation. When it was sanctioned, didn't just victimize women, it also distorted the moral compass of those who used it, creating psychological damage on both sides of the transaction. As the war turned against Japan, soldier perspectives began shifting. Shortages and chaos disrupted the comfort station system's routine. Some soldiers recorded increased discomfort with the conditions they witnessed. The system's collapse mirrored the broader military disintegration, leaving participants with unanswered questions about their role in the machinery of exploitation. Japan's surrender in August 1945 triggered the abrupt collapse of the comfort station system. Military units dissolved their command structures, leaving thousands of women abandoned across Asia. Station managers disappeared overnight, unlocking doors and telling women to find their own way home. Those in remote locations faced particularly dire circumstances, stranded without food, money, or transportation. The war had ended, but their captivity transformed into a new struggle for survival and return. The journey home became another layer of suffering. Women walked for weeks along damaged roads, begging for food and shelter in devastated landscapes. They hitched rides on military trucks or crowded onto trains already overflowing with displaced persons. Those stranded overseas faced additional challenges of crossing borders without documents or language skills. The physical injuries from their captivate-treated diseases, chronic pain, malnutrition made these journeys even more difficult. Many did not survive the trip home. Returning survivors encountered profound social stigma in their communities. Traditional values surrounding female purity led many families to view them as damaged or dishonored. Some parents pretended their daughters had been away doing factory work, creating elaborate fictions to conceal the truth. Communities often shunned the women, questioning their moral character rather than recognizing their victimhood. This social rejection compounded the trauma of their captivity, isolating them further. Families sometimes reacted with outright rejection. Fathers refused to acknowledge returning daughters, viewing them as bringing shame upon the household. Brothers expressed anger rather than compassion, concerned about how the family's reputation might affect their own marriage prospects. Some women were forced to leave their villages exiles within their own countries. The welcome home they had dreamed of during captivity never materialized. Physical and psychological injuries made rebuilding ordinary lives nearly impossible. Chronic health problems from untreated infections and injuries limited their ability to work. Psychological trauma manifested as nightmares, anxiety, and depression that went unrecognized and untreated. Many women never married or had children, either by choice or because no one would marry them. Their experience created permanent barriers to normal family life and social integration. No official acknowledgement or compensation came from Japan. The government destroyed most documentation of the comfort women's system and maintained official silence about its existence. Survivors received no medical care, financial support, or recognition of their suffering. This institutional denial extended the injustice into the post-war period, leaving women to suffer the consequences of a system the state refused to acknowledge. The war's end thus began a different kind of captivity for most survivors. They carried their trauma in silence for decades, without support systems or professional help. The physical and psychological wounds remained open, affecting their daily lives long after the stations closed. Their suffering continued unseen and unacknowledged by societies focused on rebuilding and moving forward. This collective silence descended quickly and completely. The women's stories became private burdens rather than public history. They learned to conceal their pasts from new acquaintances and even family members. The shame imposed by their communities enforced this silence more effectively than any official prohibition. They became invisible casualties of a war everyone wanted to forget. The Allies encountered evidence of the comfort women's system during liberation, but took limited action. Military intelligence documents noted the facilities and their purpose, but these received low priority in war crimes investigations. The Tokyo trials focused on other atrocities, with sexual slavery receiving minimal attention. Cold War considerations made thorough investigation of Japanese war crimes less urgent as new alliance is formed. The women's suffering became another overlooked tragedy in war's aftermath. Allied force is advancing across the Pacific began encountering the comfort station system in 1944. Documented these facilities with clinical detachment, noting their operational details and interviewing both managers and imprisoned women. Investigators compiled reports describing the systematic nature of the operation, the conditions within the stations, and the obvious coercion involved. These documents moved through military channels with proper classification and filing, creating an official record of what Allied soldiers had discovered. The Tokyo war crimes trials focused primarily on crimes against peace and conventional war crimes. Sexual slavery received minimal attention despite the evidence available. Prosecutors made strategic decisions to prioritize cases they considered more straightforward or more likely to result in convictions. The complex nature of the comfort women's system, with its bureaucratic paperwork and chain of command issues, made it challenging to prosecute under existing legal frameworks. Political considerations heavily influenced these prosecutorial decisions. Cold War realities quickly overshadowed wartime justice. American occupation authorities prioritized rebuilding Japan as a stable ally against communist expansion in Asia. Thorough investigation of Japanese war crimes became secondary to establishing a reliable partnership. Pushing too hard on issues like comfort women risked alienating the very government the United States needed to cooperate in the new geopolitical landscape. Strategic interests ultimately trumped justice for victims. The institutional silence extended beyond the trials themselves. Occupation authorities did not pursue compensation or acknowledgement for comfort women's survivors. Medical care and rehabilitation programs focused on other victim groups. The documentary evidence gathered by military intelligence was preserved but not acted upon, stored in archives where it would remain largely untouched for decades. This official inaction sent a clear message about the value placed on these women's suffering. Historians would later note the contrast with how other Axis power crimes were handled. Nazi concentration camps received extensive documentation and prosecution, while Japan's system of sexual slavery was largely ignored. This disparity reflected both the different nature of the crimes and the of the post-war period. European atrocities fit more comfortably into existing legal and moral frameworks than the calculated sexual exploitation implemented by Japanese forces. Represented another betrayal for comfort women survivors. Having endured years of systematic rape, they now faced indifference from the liberating forces. Their suffering was acknowledged in internal documents, but deemed not important enough for serious action. This institutional neglect compounded their original trauma, adding layers of official silence to their personal silence. The preserved evidence would later prove crucial when survivors finally broke their silence decades later. Military intelligence reports, occupation-era documents, and trial records provided the paper trail that confirmed the system's organized nature. But during the immediate post-war years, these documents simply gathered dust, while the women they described struggled to rebuild shattered lives without recognition or support. This chapter of inaction demonstrates how justice can become collateral damage in geopolitical calculations. The comfort women were sacrificed not once but twice, first to military necessity, then to political expediency. Their story disappeared into the gaps between legal categories and strategic priorities, waiting for a future generation to demand accountability. The silence that began with Japan's surrender was reinforced by Allied indifference, creating a historical void that would take 50 years to fill. The silence finally broke in the early 1990s when elderly Korean women began speaking about experiences they had buried for nearly 50 years. Kim Hak-sun became the first survivor to publicly testify in 1991, describing her abduction and years of sexual slavery in military brothels. Her courage created a rupture in the wall of silence that had concealed the comfort women's system since the war's end. Other survivors gradually came forward, their advanced age giving them a sense of urgency to speak before their stories were lost forever. Their testimonies revealed a systematic pattern of abuse that shocked audiences worldwide. Women described being tricked by job offers or taken by force from their villages. They spoke of transport to distant locations under armed guard, brutal initiations into sexual servitude, and daily rape by dozens of soldiers. The consistency of these accounts across different speakers and regions confirmed this was not random violence but organized exploitation. Historical researchers began uncovering documents that supported government archives and military records. Media coverage amplified the survivors' voice beyond activist circles. Newspapers across Asia and eventually Western publications reported on the emerging testimony. Television documentaries featured elderly women telling their stories directly to cameras, their faces showing decades of pain. This coverage reached audiences who had never heard of the comfort women's system, creating international awareness of a historical wrong that had been hidden for 2 generations. Survivors formed support organizations to share experiences and demand justice. The Korean Council for the Women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan became a central organization for advocacy and remembrance. Weekly protests began outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, with survivors and supporters gathering every Wednesday to call for acknowledgement and apology. These demonstrations continued for years, becoming a powerful symbol of persistent demand for historical justice. The movement quickly gained international dimensions. Women from other countries began sharing their own experiences of Japanese military sexual slavery. Filipino, Chinese, Indonesian, and Dutch survivors added their voices to the growing chorus demanding recognition. Their participation demonstrated the transnational scope of the system and created a united front across cultural and national boundaries. The comfort women issue became a shared Asian historical trauma rather than a national-specific grievance. Academic conferences and research projects documented the system's operations. Scholars from multiple countries collaborated to trace military records and reconstruct the network's scale. Their findings confirmed the institutional nature of the program and its approval at high levels of military command. This scholarly work provided the evidentiary foundation for political demands, turning personal testimony into historical fact. The breaking of silence represented a profound psychological shift for the survivors themselves. After decades of shame and isolation, they found strength in collective action and shared experience. Speaking publicly transformed them from victims into activists, reclaiming agency that had been stolen during their captivity. Their advanced age lent their testimony particular moral weight, as they had nothing left to gain personally except historical acknowledgement.
Comfort women
This issue onto diplomatic agendas between Japan and its neighbors. What began as personal testimony became an international human rights concern, challenging official narratives about the war and its aftermath. The women's courage in breaking their silence created political pressure that governments could no longer ignore, setting the stage for official responses and historical reckoning. In 1993, Japan offered its first official acknowledgement of military involvement through the Kono Statement. Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono admitted the Imperial Army's role in establishing and operating comfort stations, acknowledging coercion in the recruitment process and the immense suffering inflicted upon the women. The statement recognized the damage to honor and dignity while expressing remorse and apology. However, its careful wording left many survivors feeling the apology remained insufficiently direct and failing to address legal responsibility or provide individual compensation. This partial acknowledgement fueled rather than resolved the growing demand for justice. Survivors and advocacy groups criticized the statement's vagueness and lack of concrete actions to accompany the words. The apology seemed designed to acknowledge minimal facts without accepting full historical accountability. This perceived inadequacy ensured the issue would remain politically active rather than being resolved through this initial gesture. The 2015 agreement between Japan and South Korea attempted to create a final resolution through diplomatic channels. Japan provided 1 billion yen to a foundation supporting survivors and reiterated expressions of remorse. The South Korean government pledged to consider the matter finally and irreversibly resolved and avoid further criticism internationally. However, this agreement proved immediately controversial due to its negotiation without meaningful survivor consultation. Elderly comfort women and their advocates rejected the agreement as insufficient and exclusionary. They argued that genuine resolution required their direct participation in the process rather than diplomatic arrangements made over their heads. The agreement's language avoided the term sexual slavery in favor of less specific terminology, further alienating those who saw this as minimizing the crimes committed. Weekly protests continued unabated outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul. The terminology in the fight for recognition, the Japanese military's term comfort women, struck many survivors and historians as a euphemism obscuring the brutal reality of sexual slavery. Activists demanded recognition as military sexual slaves to accurately reflect the systematic exploitation and forced nature of their servitude. This linguistic shift represented the larger struggle over historical narrative and moral responsibility. Historical revisionists in Japan intensified their efforts to deny or minimize the comfort system as these debates continued. Some politicians and academics questioned survivor testimony, disputed documentary evidence, and downplayed the scale of the atrocities. This denialism created significant obstacles to reconciliation, undermining efforts to achieve meaningful acknowledgement of the suffering inflicted. The battle over memory became as crucial as establishing the historical facts themselves. The ongoing disputes significantly strained diplomatic relations between Japan and South Korea. Historical interpretation differences, apology adequacy disagreements, and compensation disputes regularly resurfaced in political conflicts and public protests. Trade tensions sometimes emerged alongside historical grievances, demonstrating how the comfort women issue continued affecting contemporary relations between the two nations. This struggle over recognition extended beyond bilateral relations to international forums. The United Nations and various human rights organizations addressed the comfort women system as a grave violation of human rights. The international dimension provided additional validation for survivors' experiences while increasing pressure on Japan to offer more substantive acknowledgement. The fight for historical truth had expanded from individual testimony to global historical discourse. The persistence of these debates demonstrated that formal agreements could not easily resolve deeply traumatic historical injustices. Survivors continued demanding acknowledgement that addressed the full severity of their experiences rather than diplomatic compromises. Their insistence on accurate terminology and genuine inclusion in resolution process reflected the fundamental need for their suffering to be fully seen and recognized rather than conveniently settled. Bronze statues depicting a young girl sitting solemnly in a traditional Korean dress have appeared in South Korea, then spread to the United States, Australia, Germany, and other nations with historical connections to the Pacific War. Each installation represents a physical manifestation of remembrance, creating permanent markers that challenge historical amnesia about the comfort women's system. They serve as silent witness to stories that were suppressed for nearly 50 years. These memorials frequently generate diplomatic tension when erected. Japanese government officials have formally protested their placement, particularly when they appear near diplomatic facilities or in prominent public spaces. Some local governments have faced pressure to remove the statues through official channels and behind the scenes diplomacy. The monuments have become focal points for ongoing historical disputes between Japan and its neighbors, transforming artistic expressions into political statements about memory and responsibility. Museums and educational institutions have developed extensive programming around the comfort women history. The War and Women's Human Rights Museum in Seoul provides comprehensive documentation of the system's operation and impact. University archives have collected oral histories and preserved survivor testimonies in digital formats. Educational organizations have created curricular materials for schools seeking to teach this difficult history to younger generations. These efforts ensure the story reach its audience is beyond those who encounter the physical memorials. Academic conferences and public seminars regularly address the comfort women issue as part of broader discussions about wartime sexual violence. Scholars from multiple countries collaborate on research projects that trace the system's historical documentation and contemporary implications. Their work provides the intellectual foundation for public understanding, separating historical fact from political rhetoric. This academic engagement helps contextualize the comfort women's system within larger patterns of conflict-related sexual violence. The advancing age of surviving comfort women creates urgency for these preservation efforts. Most remaining survivors are now in their late 80s or 90s, their numbers diminishing each year. Organizations race to record their testimonies through video documentation and transcribed interviews. These recordings capture not just the facts carried through decades of silence. The elderly women's participation in memorial events becomes increasingly precious as time passes. Annual demonstrations continue outside Japanese embassies in various capitals, particularly the weekly Wednesday protests in Seoul that have continued for over 30 years. These gatherings maintain public pressure for formal acknowledgement and compensation. Participants include survivors when their health permits, along with younger activists who have taken up the cause. The protests represent ongoing demand for historical justice despite diplomatic agreements that attempted closure. The memorials serve as sites of education and reflection for visitors who may know little about this history. Plaques and accompanying materials explain the system's operation and scale. Some installations include empty chairs representing the women who have passed away without seeing full justice. These physical spaces create opportunities for learning and contemplation that books and documentaries cannot provide. This global network of remembrance represents a form of historical justice achieved through civil society rather than official channels. When legal and diplomatic processes failed to provide adequate resolution, these memorials created alternative pathways for acknowledgement. They stand as permanent challenge to historical revisionism and official silence, ensuring that the comfort women's stories remain part of our collective memory. The proliferation of these memorials demonstrates how historical truth eventually surfaces, despite efforts to suppress it. From isolated testimonies to global recognition, the comfort women's story has followed a path from silence to acknowledgement through determined effort by survivors and their supporters. These bronze figures sitting in public spaces worldwide testify to the persistence of memory over political expediency. They ensure that this chapter of history will not be forgotten again. The comfort women system represented an unprecedented scale of state-sponsored sexual slavery in modern warfare. Its organization and systematic implementation distinguished it from other wartime atrocities through its institutional character rather than isolated acts of violence. Military planners created detailed regulations covering pricing structures, medical examinations, and facility management. This bureaucratic framework transformed function, complete with paperwork and accounting procedures. The system's calculated nature set it apart from random acts of wartime violence. The contrast between the clinical documentation and the human suffering it enabled remains particularly disturbing. Military records show discussions of women's transport and maintenance using the same terminology as ammunition supplies or food rations. Officers filed reports on venereal disease rates and soldier satisfaction, while women endured daily rape and abuse. This disconnect between bureaucratic language and human agony demonstrated how systems can obscure moral reality through administrative processes. The paperwork created a shield of normalcy around extraordinary cruelty. Japan's military demonstrated how modern states could weaponize sexuality for strategic purposes. The system treated women's bodies as military supplies essential for maintaining troop morale and operational efficiency. This institutional approach to sexual violence represented a new development in warfare, where rape became organized rather than incidental. The military's ability to implement this system across vast territories showed how efficiently states could mobilize resources for human exploitation when sufficiently motivated. The legacy of this system continues to influence international law and conflict resolution. Legal frameworks addressing sexual violence in armed conflict have been shaped by the comfort women case. The recognition of systematic rape as a war crime rather than an inevitable byproduct of war owes much to the documentation of this system. International tribunals and human rights organizations have drawn on this history when developing protocols for addressing gender-based violence in conflict zones. The comfort women's story serves as a permanent warning about human commodification. It demonstrates how easily human beings can be reduced to functional objects when systems prioritize efficiency over morality. The women lost their names, their histories, and their agency, becoming numbers in military logistics reports. This transformation of people into instruments represents the ultimate triumph of bureaucratic thinking over human dignity. Healing has remained elusive for most survivors despite decades passing. The psychological wounds inflicted by systematic rape and institutional betrayal have proven resistant to time's passage. Compounded the original trauma, creating layers of suffering that outlasted the war itself. The women's struggle for recognition became part of their ongoing battle with the past. Their fight for acknowledgement changed how we understand wartime sexual violence. The comfort women's testimony forced historians and legal experts to confront the organized nature of sexual exploitation in conflict. Their persistence transformed a hidden history into a subject of international discourse and legal precedent. This shift in understanding represents their most enduring victory against the system that sought to erase them. The story continues to challenge societies to confront uncomfortable historical truths. It raises difficult questions about complicity, memory, and the limits of apology. The ongoing tensions between Japan and its neighbors demonstrate how historical wounds can remain open across generations. The comfort women's experience reminds us that some injustice resist neat resolution through diplomatic agreements or financial compensation. This historical episode stands as a benchmark for understanding institutionalized cruelty. Its combination of scale, organization, and lasting impact makes it unique in the annals of modern conflict. The system's operations across multiple countries and cultures demonstrate how efficiently human suffering can be systematized when military necessity overrides moral considerations. The paperwork trail left behind provides chilling evidence of how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty through bureaucratic compliance. The comfort women system set a devastating precedent for state-sponsored sexual slavery in modern warfare. Its scale spanned thousands of miles across occupied territories, its operation organized through military regulations rather than random violence. This bureaucratic approach to human exploitation demonstrated how efficiently institutions can normalize atrocity when operational needs override moral considerations. The detailed paperwork created a veneer of legitimacy around systematic rape, treating women as military supplies rather than human beings. This history challenge is our understanding of how ordinary systems can enable extraordinary cruelty, leaving wounds that persist across generations long after the fighting has ceased.